it's been 2 days since, or less than 48 hours, but 2 days since I watched Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. And let me just say, I have some thoughts. You could probably tell by the length of this video, but I do have some thoughts. Not all of them good, but most of them good. So, this is going to be much more of a ramble, hence the name Roxy's Ramblings. The footage that you're seeing, the footage that you're seeing right now is me playing, so it's all my footage, and that is of Scott Pilgrim versus the World, the video game, the 2010. This is the 2021 re-release, but the 2010 game. And so what is there to say exactly? Well, first of all, I thought it was amazing. It's a 10 out of 10 show, and it might be my favorite. That's not true. It might be my second favorite thing to come out of the franchise, other than the comics. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. What is that exactly? Well, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is a 2023 Netflix original show that had one season. It's 4 hours long, and it's really, really weird. Chocked full of references, all sorts of different references from video games and comics and manga and anime and you name it. I mean, it's all there, even more so perhaps than the source material. This just takes it to another level. I thought that was a good thing. I got most of the references, and it really felt like something I watched as a child, which is a weird but cool experience, and so, I don't know, I liked it. It's very different than the comics. I saw somebody on Reddit the other day say, we've never gotten a good adaptation of Scott Pilgrim, and while I disagree with that sentiment, I do think we've never gotten an accurate adaptation of Scott Pilgrim. I don't know if it would be possible to make an adaptation of the comics into it like perfectly, but if it was possible, it would have to be through an animated show. I see that after watching Takes Off, but I do think they could pull it off. Takes Off was amazing, and I'm so glad that it wasn't just the comics again, because that would have made it. I mean, I still would have watched it, I still would have liked it, but I would have been bored. Before we go any further, from this point on, I'm going to do spoilers, just whenever it comes to mind. So, if you don't want to do that, go read the comics, because the show does not make sense without reading the comics first, or at least watching the movie. But there's a lot you won't understand if you just watch the movie and haven't read the comics. And also probably go watch the movie and then come back here if you don't want to be spoiled. Anyway, we're going to continue. So, the whole thing with the X's was kind of interesting, wasn't it? Like, that's not what I expected. I'm not entirely sure what I did expect. Like, going into it, I knew that there was time travel, which I totally forgot about, and that Scott dies. That's all I knew about it. And that it's about Ramona, really, and how shitty of a person she is compared to Scott, which we get to see from his point of view in the comics and the movie. And I don't know. It was really weird to see the villains sort of become the heroes of their own story. Like, sort of each episode focused on a different character and their experiences, because nobody's, just all bad. And that's one of the things that Scott Pilgrim, the comic, really liked to make clear, was that nobody's just all bad. Even though it's sort of, because it's from Scott's frame of mind, it sort of phrases all of the people that he goes up against as the bad guys, when it's mostly just because he can't realize, he doesn't want to internalize and process that he is a bad guy. So everybody is just black and white for him when it comes to the villains, or when it comes to the seven deadly axes, at least. Seven evil axes. But it was really interesting seeing that their lives and how they are not good people, but at the same time, they can move on and grow from it, or at least all but Todd Ingram. I think he's still obsessed, and I think he will be until the end of time. I thought it was really fun to get to see Mobile, and he finally has a voice. You know, he wasn't even in the movie, but he finally has a voice now, and it was a short little scene of them meeting in Paris, but it was really cute, you know? And I don't know, that whole section was just kind of cute, and we get to learn a little bit more about him and working at Nintendo. I thought the future scenes were very interesting, very solar punk, which is not something you see. I mean, if you're in that sort of circle, you see it pretty often, but that's not the sort of thing that I would expect Scott Pilgrim to take the direction in. But it's also very plausible that that's something that Scott would imagine the future to look like, which is why on a meta level, why it would look like that, not it looks like that because it's all in Scott's head. Obviously, we know from the events of the comics that magic is real and the things that happen actually happen. At least everything that's not a flashback, because if it counts as a flashback, then, you know, the thing with Kim Pine, with in the movie, it's implied that actually happened. In the comics, it's implied it didn't actually happen, or at least not the way that Scott imagined it. In the show, it's stated by Kim Pine to have happened, which means that it actually happened in that universe. So, point is, if it's a flashback in the comics, it might not have actually happened. It depends on interpretation. Yeah, I thought the mobile scene was really cute. So one thing that I really, really liked about the show is that it made me laugh as much, if not more so, than the movie the first time I watched the movie. The movie doesn't make me laugh anymore. It makes me smile a little bit, but the movie was hilarious the first time I saw it. Same thing with this. So I think the whole concept of Sparks is kind of dumb, but it spurred on the Scott Pilgrim Yuri moment, which was just so funny to me. The fact that Kim goes up and kisses Roxy, and it's so intimate and up close, like a SpongeBob close up with the level of detail, and they're like moaning as they kiss and stuff, like moaning softly, and you could hear the kiss, and then they break away and it's got the little thing of spit. It's just so intimate. And then the shot goes back and they're just like, it was worth a shot, no sparks. And then Roxy walks out singing Hamster Dance, and I just, it's such a whiplash of emotion and experience that I don't even know. It's not a feeling that can be put into words, and they intentionally did that to make me upset, me and everyone else, but specifically me. The show was made before I was a fan of Scott Pilgrim, and they still did it just for me. They knew I was gonna watch it. That was wild. That was wild, and an emotional roller coaster for sure. I still don't know how I feel about that. That was just, I didn't like, I noticed differently to both the comics and the movie, the supporting characters, Scott's supporting characters that are like his actual friends, were not focused on very heavily compared to the exes and Ramona, but she was the main character. And I thought that was kind of weird, and I was a little bit disappointed because I, of course, wanted to see more Kim Pine. But the fact that I the the fact that they didn't focus on Scott's supporting characters was just kind of weird to me, because when you take Scott out of the picture, you would think they would focus primarily on the people that were around him, but not really. I mean, they did somewhat. They didn't neglect anyone, especially young Neil. Young Neil had a whole arc, but even his script was a plot device, a plot point. But I thought they would have factored into the overall plot more than they did. I don't know why they didn't. And I expected that they would, fight in the final battle, but they didn't even do that. So it's just kind of weird. They were just kind of there. Except for a few spots like the whole kiss where they focused on that. Obviously, Kim was a major player in that episode. But it was a direction that I don't think anyone expected, to focus primarily on the evil exes. Ramona is sort of an obvious choice. If you can't have Scott, you're going to go with Ramona. But yeah. Also, something I thought of while reading the Scott Pilgrim comics for the first time — I'm currently on my second read — is that Scott, because of the way that the comic is, Scott, I should clarify what I mean by that. The way that it's phrased, the way that the story is approached or set up, if that makes sense. Scott is the main character, but you could have Scott Pilgrim as a franchise without Scott Pilgrim, basically. And I was thinking that because the supporting characters are so rich and diverse that they feel like people you know. I can point to them and say, yes, I know exactly what they're like. I've met people like that. My friends are like that. Whatever. I'm like that. So much so that you, even just in the source material, you've really, even if not a lot of time is spent on them, you really get a feel for what their character is, which I think is one of the greatest strengths of the Scott Pilgrim franchise as a whole, but especially the comics. And I just was blown away by how Takes Off did the exact same thing, better than the movie even did. The movie didn't have a lot of time. The show had twice the amount of time to do something totally different. The movie had to adapt 6 volumes of comics into a 2-hour span. Not easy to do. The show has to adapt. It has to take the original comics, the original 6 volumes. It has twice as much time to play with things, and it gets to do a different story. Obviously, the show is going to be superior if it can pull it off, which I do believe it did. We'll get back to why I think it didn't in some aspects, but I want to save my criticisms for later on down the line and keep praising it. So, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. Like I said, while reading the comics, I was thinking you could take Scott out of this and have it still be Scott Pilgrim, which is not something that's easy to do for a lot of comics. Superhero comics, you take the superhero out. I mean, there's certain aspects to it that are interesting. Like, take Superman, for example. If Superman disappears, you've got his villains, which are cool. Not as cool as Superman, but they're cool. And then you've got, his supporting cast, and that's about it. And his supporting cast is cool, but you kind of have to do something different with them. And you absolutely can. I mean, Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane and Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen are not just great comics, but they sold super well at the time, and people today still like them, myself included. to a great extent. They're really good. So obviously you can do something with it, but that had to be altered. You know, the DNA, what made the Superman comic Superman, was removed from that and focused on a different character. It had different types of plots. It was a romance comic more so. It was a different sort of action comic. It wasn't a superhero comic anymore. It was drama, basically. And Scott Pilgrim, you can take Scott Pilgrim out of it, and it's basically the same thing. I mean, they spun it. They spun Takes Off as more of a mystery. I mean, they even say who done it. Like, one of the episodes is even called, well, I think it's Who Did It, because it's a play on that. But they literally say who done it, like, you know, in the who done it scenario, when they're trying to figure things out. So obviously they framed it as a mystery, like Clue or whatever. But they took Scott Pilgrim out of Scott Pilgrim, and it was still Scott Pilgrim. It's called Scott Pilgrim. It feels like Scott Pilgrim. It feels more like Scott Pilgrim than the movie does. And not only that, but I think they majorly stuck the landing for nearly every part of it. I say nearly, and we'll get back to that. The voice acting, first off. Okay, so I've voiced my opinions before, not on this channel, but on the League of Comic Geeks, about how I feel about the portrayals of the characters in Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the movie. And I don't... Overall, it's a mixed bag. I think Mark Webber as Stephen Stills was amazing, and while he gave a different performance to how I imagined Stephen in the comics, he did it very well, so much so that I can accept his Stephen as the definitive Stephen. Alison Pill, I was not sure if she could pull it off, and while it was a little bit exaggerated, and this is no criticism of her as an actress or a person, it's entirely with the direction that I have issue with. Because of the time constraints, I don't think she was characterized as well as she should have been. Like when Scott when he said that time with Kim, and he said that's over now, she's fine, whatever, and she glares at him, you know. That was just a quick bit that was supposed to give you a little bit of insight on their backstory, because we didn't get to see that backstory because there wasn't as much time as, you know, the comics, where in Volume 1 we get to see how their relationship progressed, and then he had to leave and said bye or whatever. Alison Pill made a great Kim, especially for the voice, you know. That's not how I imagined Kim's voice, but it might as well have been. Because I do think she should be the definitive voice, and I'm glad she is. I don't like how the movie didn't give her enough time, in my humble opinion. Kim Pine is my favorite non-hero character in fiction. So yeah, that should say a lot. And that happened after just reading the comics. So I felt like she was kind of done a little bit dirty in the movie, and that's why I'm a little bit surprised that she was... I feel, at least, I'm sure most people don't feel this way, but I feel she was done a little bit dirty in, as well as Stephen Stills and the other supporting cast in the show, because they didn't give her enough time in the movie, and they could have in the show. But I'm glad we got what we did, because it was definitely appreciated, you know, the scenes that we did get. And they were, I was about to say sufficiently funny. They're not sufficiently funny. They were absolutely hilarious. I belly laughed and fell over on the couch when I watched those scenes. It wasn't sufficiently funny. Anyway, Kim Pine, I wish they would have done more with him. Yes, the voice direction. So I had so Kieran Cullen, other than, I'm pretty sure Wallace is supposed to be Asian in the comics. That's all I can read him as is Asian. Like that. I don't know if that's just me. I think he's supposed to be like Asian, and in the movie he's white, and I'm like, okay, that's fine. And then we go to the show, and you can't really tell if he's white or Asian. And I'm like, is he supposed to be a like mixed, or what is he supposed to be? That I just got a little bit hung up on that because I don't know. I don't know. In the comic, it seems very clear that he's Asian, but it seems they didn't want to do that. I mean, because they're like, oh, Karen Cullen's going to be great for the movie. We'll just get him. Fine, whatever. But I can't tell what he's supposed to be, and I haven't seen if O'Malley has ever clarified. I haven't seen anybody talk about it. I haven't asked anybody. This is the first time I'm speaking about it publicly. But I don't know. That was just a not a point of contention, but just a little curiosity for me. I'm like, is he supposed to be white or is he supposed to be Asian? Did I read the comics wrong, or are they just going a different direction? From since 2010, basically, or starting in 2010 and onwards. I was going to say, because he looks exactly the same. Pretty much everyone looks exactly the same in the game as they do the comics, except for Envy Adams with her hair. Her hair is much closer to Kim's hair with the color, which they also sort of did with the show, versus in the movie where it's blonde, and the comics where she doesn't have such deep red hair. It's a whole thing. Anyway, that's off topic. Envy Adams, Brie Larson is just an excellent voice for her. She plays her perfectly. No notes. Young Neil, in the movie, I thought he did a great job, but in the show, I thought they actually did him a disservice, and we'll get back to that. That's one of my major criticisms. But I didn't like the performance of him there. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't a bad performance. I have an issue with the voice direction here, not the actor himself. I think everyone did an excellent job for voice acting, which I'll touch on a bit later. But I don't think the young Neil voice that he used, that, what is it, Johnny's, I can't remember his name. Anyway, Johnny, I can't remember the last name, sorry. I think the voice that he did for the show laid it on too thick. I don't think it worked the way that it was intended to. Or at least the way that the comic wanted to portray him. And that's my own personal opinion, but pretty much all of this is. But anyway. So overall, and of course, Ramona Flowers, great. Mary Elizabeth Winstead, pretty much always great, as far as I'm aware. The voice direction, they got all the same people from the movie, which was kind of a surprise that they were able to get everyone. But I thought they did a spectacular job. It's a pretty common, well, I wouldn't say it's like pretty common, but it's a fairly common thing for actors to say, hey, I think I can voice act, how hard can it be? And then they do an absolutely egregious job. I can't remember which wrestler, but there was a wrestler that did that. I think he did voices for video games, and it was just terrible. It's not one-to-one. If you're a voice actor, you can't necessarily live act, and if you're a live actor, you can't necessarily voice act. Maybe the people got voice coaches or something, maybe, but just the way the lines were recorded and everything felt really natural and really good. I don't know if they had them in separate booths or if they had them sort of face to face looking at each other and sort of acting as they did it. That would be my guess, is that they have them in all separate booths, but they can see each other or whatever, and then they read their lines so they can sort of play off of each other and get the feeling, as well as the voice director telling them what emotion they should do for it and stuff like that. I think that might have been how it went, because it just feels so natural. but I don't know that for certain. That's just a guess. I know that that sometimes happens, which is why I say that, but I don't know if that was the case here. And but overall, all of the people that they got, as far as I'm aware, do acting primarily, and even if they have done voice acting in the past, acting is their big gig, and so it's interesting to see how well all of them transferred over to voices, because all of them did it perfectly. What they were told to do, pretty much, in my opinion, and that's completely unexpected, at least for me, because, like I said, normally the results are mixed. So, I don't know, but whoever was in charge of the voices overall, excellent job. Round of applause, because, wow, yeah. Um, the final thing that I'll touch on with that is I didn't like how Michael Cera portrayed Scott Pilgrim in the movie. I understand that's how Michael Cera be. Michael Cera, Michael Cera's, He's gonna Michael Cera. If you get Michael Cera, he's gonna Michael Cera. At the same time, I think he could have stood to work a little bit more on his Scott instead of just playing himself. I'm sure he's great in other shows. I haven't seen, what is it? He was in Arrested Development, right? I haven't seen that. But, I like him as an actor. He seems like a cool dude outside of being an actor. And, I mean, he did an okay job at it. Like I said, I'm going to complain about his performance as Scott, but at the same time, if you ask me both before I watch the movie and after I watch the movie who I would rather play as Scott Pilgrim in a live-action movie, I would have said Michael Cera. So, but Scott's voice was very timid, and he's very socially awkward, which is not how comic Scott is portrayed at all. He's a loser. He probably has ADHD or autism. That's me speculating. I do have both, so I feel qualified to speculate, but it is speculating. And he's a charismatic loser is how I describe it. He knows how to get what he wants and how to shut people down when he wants and do all of that. He knows how to manipulate people, but he doesn't misunderstand. He's not socially awkward. He doesn't misunderstand. He's just, sometimes nervous or, that sort of thing. So it's different. There's a distinction to be made there. And if you are watching this and haven't read both the comics and watched the movie, I would advise you to do so because I'm spoiling both right now. But if you have, I think you see what I mean with that distinction there. It's not the same thing. I think while Michael Cera's portrayal of Scott in the movie worked for the movie, I don't like that it's become sort of the definitive way that people see Scott. Like, it even drove my mom when she watched the movie to say that she wished that Scott would have ended up with knives because Ramona's too good for him because she's, normal or whatever, and Scott's just a loser, just a socially awkward loser. That sort of thing. And I think if you haven't read the comics, that's the impression that you'll get, and it's a very different dynamic compared to the comics. That being said, however, while I didn't really like the portrayal of Scott in the movie, I think it's completely different in the show. I think they really wanted to rectify that, and even though they got all the same people, they got, I almost called him Scott, Michael to do or Sarah to do a different voice, I don't even know how to describe it, more dignified voice, a voice more like mine, basically. More so, not the way I'm talking right now, but the way I normally talk, like on my streams and stuff. I don't know if there's a term for that or whatever, but it's not shy, it's not socially awkward, it's just normal for the sort of people that Scott and I are, if that makes sense. And that's how I imagined Scott's voice to be in the first place. I imagined, as I put it originally, I imagined Scott's voice to be a mix of my voice and lots of other, basically all the guys I knew in high school, because we were all, kind of like Scott. And the movie is so drastically different from that it was sort of whiplash. But the show, they got him to voice act and actually do a different performance. And it really, there's still some of that social awkwardness, but overall, it really comes across how I think the comics wanted to portray Scott. And there were points that I couldn't believe it was the same guy. I could not hear that it was Michael Cera, which is crazy, but it's the same guy. So I don't know how they did that. They must have done voice coaching for him, but it was just blew me away. And the voice that Michael Cera did for the show is much closer to how I imagined he would speak in the comics than what we got in the movie. So I thought that was the biggest point of voice acting, so I'd leave it for last. But anyway, moving on. I think I've said most of what I wanted to about the good stuff. I might make an addendum, or something in a later video if I've forgotten anything. But I think that covers most of what I wanted to say. Now, here's the bad things. There's two things that I can think of in particular. Number one is how Young Neil is handled. Number two is the ending. So, one more thing about the voice acting. I liked Old Scott. I thought it was an interesting performance. I liked Old Scott. Anyway, the way he did the voice, I mean. So the ending, I didn't like it that much. Number one, anticlimactic. I mean, we get this big fight, and then they're not even all going at Old Scott at once. I thought the reveal of, like, the even older Scott was kind of lame. I don't know, it's just kind of lame. And then, on top of that, okay. Well, okay. So, I thought it was weird that Scott's friends just kind of stood there and didn't fight, because it doesn't focus on that, but obviously that happens. You can see that they just get zapped back to the movie theater or whatever. And then all of the exes fight basically one at a time, which is probably not how it would go. I don't know why they did it like that. I thought that was bad. I didn't think it looked that great. Whatever. I am obviously not one to cry woke or, the left is ruining our media. Not a political channel. This is not a political thing. I don't believe the West has fallen. I don't believe diversity is a bad thing. I don't think, all of that stuff. I can't believe I have to put those clarifications in there, but I know somebody's going to bitch about it if I don't. So I don't believe any of that. I don't have any of those feelings whatsoever. But that being said, even me, a woman, found it a little condescending for them to, for the ending to essentially be, this one's just a punk, he's just an innocent kid who doesn't know anything, which discredits Scott's agency and the decisions he's made with the cheating and everything. He absolutely knows what he's doing. He's not an idiot. That the movie made him out to be an idiot. He's not an idiot, actually. He just doesn't know how to go through life. And you're discrediting his character by saying he's just an idiot. Kim said that he's just an idiot. His friends say he's just an idiot because they don't like how he takes advantage of them. And the mistakes he's made, because they can see him making those mistakes. That's why they call him that. Kim called him that in the movie because of the way that he treated her. He treated her very poorly, and that's why she feels that way. That doesn't mean that he's actually stupid. And for the super Ramona, I think is what it's called, the joined consciousnesses of the Ramona of the present and the Ramona of the future, calling him an idiot is a disservice to his character. As well as snapping that. I understand that even older Scott made a mistake and he needs to learn from that mistake. Obviously, he's the final big bad. Obviously, older Scott made a mistake. Old Scott made a mistake. And then even older Scott made an even bigger mistake because he misread the situation and he went way off, and that needs to be rectified. Whatever. But the way that he's just dismissed like he's nothing, like he's not a major player, it feels like the joined consciousnesses of the two Ramonas see Scott as lesser of a person than she is, which is not at all a healthy dynamic. And it's not just like girl power, that's what somebody who was like that would have a problem with it, the anti-woke people or whatever. It's girl power. You can't believe they had her be the main character. That's not the issue. She worked great as the main character. I thought she would work great before I watched the movie as the main character. That's not the issue. The issue is the way that she treats both the young Scott and older Scott seems to imply that she thinks maybe not, not all men are lesser, but at least that Scott is lesser. And that's kind of worrying for their relationship. That might mean that Scott's in a toxic relationship and Ramona hasn't grown as much as we thought. And I don't think that was the intention. I think it was supposed to be, oh, Scott, you're being so silly. And the point was that he's trying to stop himself from making this perceived mistake when really he was the one making the mistakes. Not by dating Ramona, but by not communicating with her and going off and doing his own thing, training for 10 years, all of that. That was the mistake. I understand that. I understand he's in the wrong in this case. He made a mistake. That's fine. But to belittle him so much was a point of contention for me. That was an issue for me. And maybe it was just due to time. I don't know. But the way that they treated it was like that. I also thought it was kind of weird that they combined the two Ramonas because then they just go back. But, they just split up again because, older Ramona goes back to the future. I mean, it's kind of weird. And they never address the problem with the time travel, which is a really obvious problem. Because they don't address it, it wouldn't be if they didn't address it. But if older Scott went back in time, unless there was already a paradox established, which there didn't seem to be in this timeline, which is an alternate timeline or universe than the comics and the movie. That's been established. That's fine, because things went differently before Scott was pulled out of time. That's fine. That's different. It's a different timeline, different universe, whatever. Scott was pulled out of the timeline, and it didn't erase the timeline that he went into, probably because he went from one universe to another, and he's an anchor point or something, if you want to use TVA speak. Whatever. So, his universe didn't collapse. The other universe didn't collapse. But that's just the thing. The other universe didn't collapse. The future didn't collapse when he went there. So either it was a pre-established paradox, or older Scott just created a divergent timeline of his universe, assuming it even was his universe in the first place. Which it probably was, because of how they described it. They could disconnect the robot from the time stream, which means that he experienced his life in a singularity, which means that he experiences all of time at once, which is at least from his well, no, because he's out of the time stream, it would be all of time that he experiences all at once. So, with that explanation, that means that it is the same universe. But it implies, unless there's something different that they didn't explain, it implies that by dragging Scott out of the timeline and having him gone for what, like 2 weeks? It was like 2 weeks, maybe longer. Could have been a month or something. I mean, I didn't keep up with that while I was watching. I'm sure somebody went back and checked, but it's like at least 2 weeks that he's gone. In doing that, because time marched on, and then they put him back after that 2 weeks and didn't put him back when he first got there, so that the original plot of the comics could proceed. That means that he's automatically created a divergent timeline by pulling Scott out at that point. Which means that automatically, by showing him the future, or at least just pulling him out of that millisecond, he's already created a different future that's going to go differently than how he lived. And butterfly effect. So who the hell knows how differently that could go? You know? It totally different. It could go entirely different. We have no clue how it's going to end up. And that's part of it, is you make your own destiny. Whatever. That's a fine moral and all, but we're talking about the actual logistics right now. And the logistics are not logisticking. So Scott's not very smart, is what I'm saying, when dealing with time travel. I don't think he thought it through very well. And Ramona's plan was just stupid. You know, putting a script back in what was supposed to happen, in quotation marks, because if we make our own destiny, it wasn't actually supposed to happen. It's just something she wanted to happen because she felt bad about what her partner is doing to her partner in the past, which is presumably the same guy. Shouldn't he have the agency to do that to himself at the very least? I mean, like, it raises so many flags with how their relationship is going. Like, they split up. He creates a plot. She learns about the plot, makes her own plot to try to undermine his plot. That's not healthy. I mean, come on, guys. I mean, as well as said, they really are a match made in heaven. They're both terrible people, and they haven't grown out of that. And we can see that. It's been like, nearly 30 years. Nearly 30 years for the even older versions of both character. And they haven't grown out of it. It's crazy. So, anyway. So I thought that was just fucking weird that they did it like that. That was the ending, that was the sort of moral, and that was the path that they chose to go down. I didn't like it at all, and I think there's some major issues with it, which I hope, I pray, I have sufficiently outlined so that nobody will claim anything of me other than what I'm saying here. Anyway. Then comes my other major criticism, which is young Neil. And after that is probably all I have to say, unless I remember something while talking about young Neil. Obviously, the golf cart arc was hilarious. Loved that. But young Neil isn't that much of an idiot. Kind of similar to Scott. It's kind of weird to, take that away from him. It's just, he's not that dumb. He's not so oblivious. Sure, it was funny the first few times, but it got kind of old kind of fast. And when it did get old, it got really old. The voice that they used for him seemed to be young Neil from the movie, but like times 20 on the just dripping with the dumbness. And I didn't appreciate that because that's not how I feel young Neil was portrayed in the comics. I don't think that's what O'Malley was going for. And O'Malley was an executive producer on this show, which means that he basically looked over it and signed off on everything. To my understanding, that's how it works with executive producers. But that doesn't mean that he got any say in how the characters were portrayed. It just said that he signed off on it. And I think treating young Neil like an idiot is a disservice to his character. I mean, like, sure, he wasn't the brightest guy, but the movie really played up how dumb he was as a sort of, is this a thing, anti-foil to Scott? Like a comparison rather than a contrast, if that makes sense. Like, Scott, if he wasn't such a terrible person, basically, is how I felt the comic portrayed him. But it also kind of portrayed him like that in the movie, because they dumbed Scott down, sort of, and made him just more of an idiot, where I don't think that's how he was meant to be portrayed. And so, like I said, while it was funny at first, it got old fast, and I also don't like the way that they did the voice, which I think I said before. I don't like the way that it feels like they're making fun of him instead of him just not being that smart, if that makes sense. That's my main issue with it, is it feels like they're making fun of young Neil, and I have an issue with that because young Neil's a great character and a cool dude. So I don't know. He was funny in the movie. The level of dumbness was pretty funny in the movie. And no hate towards the guy, of course. I think he makes a great young Neil. Great vocal performance, especially in the movie. I think he did it. Great portrayal. But I would have preferred if the writers of the show and the voice director would have kept young Neil more in line with his comic portrayal rather than the movie portrayal, and then amping that up from the movie. The golf cart arc was funny. I can see young Neil from any part of the franchise feeling that way over a golf cart. Honestly, I could see myself feeling that way over a golf cart, and I think I've proven, hopefully, that I'm not an idiot. At least not when it comes to media literacy. So, I think the golf cart arc was, it was certainly appreciated. I do think it was funny. And with that, I think that's all I have to say about it, really. It's a 10 out of 10 show. It is. For all my criticisms and all my quibbles with it, I do think it is a 10 out of 10 show. I do think it is one of the best animated shows I've ever watched. And that is a high bar. We're talking, like, tons of animated shows that I've seen. And I think it's one of the best. So, obviously, I did overall like this show. And don't let my criticisms prevent you from watching it if you haven't watched it. I would recommend reading the comics before watching the show because there are some things that you will miss and that are explained better in the comic if you read that first. Also, it's just a great time, and if you like the movie, you're gonna like the comic because it's just that but more, and not as fast-paced, so it's easier to digest. But I think it's the second best thing to come out of the franchise. If we're considering the franchise to be 4 different media, where let's say it's the 6 volumes of the comic. I know there's more than this. I'm saying if we consider the 6 volumes of the comic, the 2-hour movie, the game from 2010, the tie-in game, and this show. If those are the 4 parts of Scott Pilgrim, the comics are the best, then this show, so the comics are more than a 10 out of 10, literally my favorite thing ever to be made. Then the show, which is one of, not the best, but one of the best animated shows I've ever watched. Then the movie. Movie's great, 9 out of 10. One of my favorite movies. Great movie. Did its best job that it could have. And then the game. And the game's a 6 out of 10. The game's not that good. It's not great. It's an okay beat 'em up. It's not that great. So, that's my rankings. You guys, I know you would want to know my rankings. That's the rankings. I've talked for nearly an hour now, so I'm going to go ahead, wrap this up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that wasn't too much of a rambling. I sort of lost my train of thought there for a minute, but I think I covered everything that I wanted to cover. I think I got my thoughts out there. And if I do have any other thoughts, I can or will make a second video. I hope you enjoyed the gameplay that you're seeing here. I know I'm not that good. And this is the game that I think is the worst out of the four. But it's also a game that you can sit and watch gameplay of. So I thought it would work pretty well for this video. Anyway, with that all said, make sure you've subscribed to the channel if you haven't already. Make sure to leave a like and share to your friends if you think this review, this rambling, would be good for any of your friends if they've seen any of this. And if they haven't, force them to. It's amazing. They need to see it. Yeah, that's pretty much it. And I will see you guys next week with another video. I feel like there's something else I was supposed to say. Is there something else I was supposed to say? Maybe I am an idiot. Skull.